Hey, I'm Chris Epp from Make Everything, and today we're going to put a motorized TV lift in this antique cabinet. Check it out. Okay, so getting started, I was just sort of checking out the cabinet and seeing what was going on. The backstory behind this was the client had actually picked this up secondhand at like a garage sale or something, and she'd had it for a couple of years. It's a nice, nicely made cabinet, and it's definitely got a lot of character. It's going to fit really well in her particular house. But I wanted to be careful in the way that I disassembled it. I didn't want it to fall apart. A lot of times with these um, cabinets, it's a lot of mortise and tenons, and there's a lot of stuff where if you sort of start to deconstruct them, they sort of just fall apart. This one was no different. It had a lot of mortise and tenons in it, a lot of rabbets and dados sort of locking things together, very few fasteners, and it was pretty robust. So once I sort of messed with the cabinet a little bit, I got a better idea of what I was going to do with the lift. Now, the client purchased the lift independently and had it shipped over to the shop. This is a motorized lift that she got from Amazon. It uses a remote control. It does have stops for the highest point and the lowest point that you can set depending on the size of your TV. Overall, I was super impressed by this thing. I'd never used this particular brand lift before. And like I said, the client just found it herself on Amazon, but it was really well made, and I was happy to install it in this. I was a little hesitant because you don't want to install something that you don't trust, but um, I think this one's going to last a long time. So with these TV lifts, there's a bracket that goes on the actual TV, very similar to a wall mount, and then that bracket gets mounted to that articulating arm, and it goes up and down. So I just did a little bit of messing around, getting the hardware installed, and here I'm just peeling some stuff off the back of the TV. And I'm being cautious of not blocking any of the ports, which is important with this kind of thing, especially in this application where I'm really only going to have one shot to get the TV to fit, and I'm not going to be able to adjust it at the client's house once I have all her different accessories attached to the TV. So sort of messing around, figuring out what's going to fit, what height's going to work. The goal here is to make the cabinet as low as possible. So I want to make everything as compact and as tight to the bottom as I possibly can, which means moving the TV mount as far up on the TV and as far down on the column. So it's really, really tight. The cabinet itself is going to go at the foot of the client's bed, and we don't really want it sticking up too high above the bed sheets. So the goal is to build this whole assembly at the absolute smallest it can be and then modify the cabinet to meet that minimum height. So I'm taking a lot of measurements here. I'm just sort of making sure that I know exactly what I can build, and I tighten everything up, sort of double check. And once I get my measurements together, I can start to build the frame that's going to go around this whole thing. So once I had made the dimensions off of the actual TV and the lift, I decided to do some marking out on the top of the unit. It's a little hard to tell in this shop, but the top of the unit is in pretty bad shape, and we had decided that the top was going to need to be repainted anyway, so I did some pencil marks on there. Now I'm just using 3/4 inch sanded plywood to build the box. I probably could have used 1/2 inch, but 3/4 inch was what I had, and I like to sort of overbuild with a 3/4 inch, and it's got less of a chance to move. This is going to be painted, and anytime I paint plywood, I get nervous that the drying paint is going to affect the plywood stability and make it warp. I decided to do 45-degree miters on the corners of this box because you are going to see a little bit of it on the bottom side of the cabinet, and it just makes things a little bit cleaner. I set my saw to 45 degrees using a digital angle finder, and I just do these cross cuts. And this can be a little dangerous. You want to be really careful when you're cross cutting material this big without a sled. Overall, though, I found that this saw in particular powers through 45-degree miters, and I don't really have to worry about it binding up on me at all. Just checking everything as I cut it and running it through. So now I want to spray paint the inside of this box black. I don't want it to look like wood when you look into the cabinet when the TV is open. My local store didn't have any black latex paint, so I wound up having to buy a spray paint can. I kind of would have rather painted these with a roller because the spray paint finish was not so great. I wound up going back and putting a couple of coats on it, but it's a little easier to cover flat panels like this with a roller. Spray paint's a lot better when you're painting something a little less regular. But this stuff dried fast and it worked pretty well. Once everything was painted and dried, I just assembled the box as I would any sort of rectangular cabinet. Here I'm using 1.5" 18 gauge brad nails and some glue, cleaning out a little bit of the squeeze out there. I'll actually have to go back and repaint the inside corners of this because the glue, the paint wasn't really 100% dry, so the glue and the wet rag sort of smudged it. But pretty straightforward assembly, just glue on all the seams and some brad nails to keep it all together while the glue dries. And I add some more just for extra strength. And I go through with a square and just make sure everything's nice and square. And the bottom I had actually left big, and I cut it to fit, just to make sure that I had a really nice tight fit on the bottom of the cabinet. And what I was thinking was, in order to reach into that cabinet and secure this mount would be pretty difficult. So I decided to mount the column of the lift to the base of this box before I even put it all together. And here I'm just taking off the TV mount area. And now to make things a little more manageable, I put it on this crate. And here I'm just drilling a hole for that control cable to come out the bottom. And this hole will also act as the cable for all her accessories, as the area for all of her accessory cables to run up through. And this will be on the front side of the back side of the cabinet, the front side of where the lift is, facing the bed. And I put a couple of pins in that bottom side, and then I decided to firm it up with screws because this is really where all the weight is going to be. The way that I've designed this cabinet, the bottom of this box is actually going to sit directly on the floor, so the screws might be a little overkill, but I just wanted to make sure everything stayed nice and sturdy, especially while it was being moved. I didn't want the bottom to fall out with all that weight from the column. That thing is pretty heavy. And now that it's got a test assembly, I can sort of make sure everything's going to work, make sure the TV is going to fit. And again, you can see I tried to make it as tight as I possibly could with the height of the TV and the height of the column. And now that the box is functioning, it's time to modify the cabinet to fit the box inside it. So I'm finding the center of the cabinet, which happens to be the center of that rib. And I'm sort of laying out how that box is going to fit through the cabinet. My original thought was to cut out a pocket in the bottom of the cabinet and slide it up, but you'll see that didn't really work. I wound up basically having to strip all the guts out of the cabinet and then put some back in after I was done. So I'm starting just with like a pry bar and an oscillating tool to sort of cut things up. And pretty quickly I realized that the bottom of the cabinet is just going to sort of have to come out. And I'm fighting right now with a big tenon that was in the center support piece of the cabinet. And this thing was surprisingly well put together. A lot of times these antique cabinets just sort of fall apart once you take out one piece, but this center piece really gave me a hard time. I tried breaking it out, but again, I didn't want to damage the cabinet. And the front started to sort of come apart a little bit, but I was able to secure it back up with some hidden fasteners. And I wound up just cutting it with the Sawzall. And that worked out really well. So now the inside of the cabinet is completely stripped. I knew that I wanted to lay out a certain size on the top. I wanted the top to just fit inside that box that I just made that holds the TV and the lift. So I laid out some low adhesion blue painter's tape. This is the, we always call it orange core tape. It's supposedly safe for painted surfaces, wallpaper, but you're going to see soon it wasn't so great for the top of this cabinet, which is unfortunate. But anyway, I laid out the blue tape and I wrote down all my lines. I was very careful to make sure everything was nice and square and straight. And then I'll go and take my track saw and I'll rip out this panel. Now, a track saw is pretty key here because I'm going to use the piece that I cut out on top of the TV so that it really looks seamless when the TV is in the closed position. I really want it to look like there's nothing even going on with this cabinet, just an ordinary cabinet at the foot of a bed. So I'm very careful with the track saw, and this is sort of where that plunge feature of the track saw shines because you can dive it into the material and pull it out. And I'm really I'm trying to sneak up on my lines and keep things nice and tight. And I'm going to go back with a handsaw after, and I'm going to cut away the corner reliefs and make everything slide together. And this piece will come in and out with just an 1/8 inch kerf. Might even be thinner than 1/8 inch on this particular saw blade. Here you can see how I plunge the cut in. And I'm really careful to just stop right at that line and pull the blade out. And now I can remove the tape and relieve those corners. And here you're going to see, unfortunately, the paint was already chipping on the top and the tape peeled a little bit of it off. So the top is going to have to be repainted, but it's not a huge deal. It was all scratched up before I started, so we sort of expected that. And I'm just using a little flush cutting saw here to relieve those corners and cut out the area where the saw didn't get to, but you can still see it leaves a really nice cut. The kerf of this handsaw is about the same as the kerf of the blade on the track saw, so it cleans everything up really nice, and very little edge preparation and edge treatment has to be done after this little handsaw operation. Now that piece popped out. So now what I can do is I can put the cabinet, which you can see is much taller than the box. And like I said, I'm going to have to modify the cabinet to lower it to the height of the box. But for now, I just want to see sort of how everything fits together. So I block up the box that's holding the TV, and I lay the cabinet down basically on top of it in order to see how it sits inside there. Everything looks good. The cut that I made is slightly smaller than the opening in the TV box, but you can see right there, I almost made a mistake. In the final use of this, the TV has to face the back of the cabinet so it can face into the bed. So I almost did it backwards, but I corrected that luckily before I glued anything into place. So I want to put the piece I cut out of here back on here, and I want to use the top of this mount as the mounting point. I left these 2 screws loose, and I'll use those. So I need to measure up, and I need to get right here, right to the top of my box, but the bottom of this poplar work top. So I'm at pretty much exactly 3 inches, a little shy. So a little shy of 3. And what I'll do now is I'll make a spacer block minus the thickness of this piece of poplar, which looks like 3/4. So it'll be like 2 1/4, and that block will get attached to this, and then when the TV goes up and down, so will this block. So I was fortunate in that the blocks that I had been using, the scrap wood blocks that I had been using to hold up that box, happened to be like exactly the size that I needed. Look at that. This is basically perfect. So what I did now was I screwed in those screws, and then I'm just going to use a hammer here, and I'm going to just give it a couple of taps, and that's going to leave the screw heads an impression on the bottom of that piece of wood. And it's going to give me a perfect lineup for when I drill my holes with a Forstner bit to accept those. So I'm going to do a pilot hole in all 4 spots that the point of my Forstner bit will find. And then I'm just going to use a small Forstner bit for the 2 screws that I'm leaving in place to sort of go around the heads. And now I'm drilling out a through hole that my bolt will go through. And then I'm going to take a Forstner bit and I'm going to counterbore that so that I don't have to use a very, very, very long screw. I only have about 1.5 inch long screw that will thread into that column, so I had to make sure that the hole was deep enough that the screw with washers would make a nice engagement, get nice and tight. You can see how it sits nice and flush with the top of the box, and that's what I'm going for. And the TV can still go in and out. And this will get painted black so that it blends in with the rest of it. Now I'm just going to paint the outside of the actual box. At first I was going to paint half of it white, the part that would be inside the cabinet, and then I decided to just paint the entire thing black. Again, using the spray paint, not ideal. I really wish I would have rolled this out, but the spray paint did turn out fine. You're only going to see about 10 inches of the bottom of this box if you were to look underneath the cabinet, because like I said, this box is going to go all the way to the floor. So I covered it with a little bit of paint, and now I'm just painting the edges and the bottom of the panel that I cut out. And I'm just sort of making sure I spray from the bottom up so I don't get any overspray on the top with the original paint finish. And it worked out really well. So now the box is essentially done, and I know it's going to fit, so I take some glue and I put glue around the edge, and then I am going to drop the cabinet onto it and make sure everything's lined up nice. Just sort of checking the inside, seeing how much room I have left in there. Now I can add that block back in, and you can see how it's painted black now and blends in much nicer. My thought here is that when the client paints the top or has someone paint the top, they can paint that inside edge as well. I did not want to spray paint that. So what I decided to do here was just put some hot glue on that block, the same way I would do a cabinet face. And this allows you to sort of slide the top around and make sure that it's perfectly lined up while the glue is still wet. And then it sets really quickly. And that hot glue is actually going to give it a really nice bond. And I had drilled some holes in the bottom of that block, and I'm going to run some screws up through it and into the top of the cabinet so that it's really nice and secure. Sliding the TV on there just to make sure everything's really nice and tight. I wanted this to be as compact as I possibly could make it. You can see how nice that top piece just floats right above the TV. And now it's just sort of checking the height of everything, checking the height of the cabinet. And here's where I'll cut the legs down. So this little trick for cutting the legs down, I'm taking a piece of scrap plywood and I'm screwing it to the bottom of that box. And now once it's screwed to the bottom of the box, I'm going to use a fine tool, an oscillating tool, to just cut the existing legs. Now the legs are going to be just slightly shorter than the cabinet, but in all reality, I don't want any weight on the legs, because weight on the legs would mean this box was pulling down on the top of the cabinet, and I want all the weight on the bottom of the box. And in order to get the top to close really nice and flush, I had to put a little bit of a stop inside the cabinet, but that was no big deal. I just used a scrap piece of pine, and that'll also get painted black so that it blends in really nicely. Now, to add some stability to this whole thing, I decided to add a block behind the TV box and through this base piece of the cabinet. Now, this was a really robust piece of wood in the cabinet, so I knew if I screwed this block in from both sides, it would add a lot of stability, and when lifting the cabinet, you wouldn't have to worry about that box just ripping out. My concern was that two people would try and pick this cabinet up from either side, and the cabinet would go, but the box would stay on the ground because that TV lift is really heavy, and the box is pretty heavy too. It's nearly a whole sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. So I put some screws in from the outside, countersunk nice, and then I put some screws in from the inside, and they all tie into that little block that I put in there and really just tighten this whole thing up. Now just sort of giving it another up and down, making sure everything's nice and tight and looking good. And I wanted to leave something inside the cabinet so that it's at least a little bit functional. So I actually took the original shelves and I marked them out based on how they would have to be cut in order to fit around the box that I put in there. And I'm just marking right on the shelves, and then I'm just following up my lines, just using a straight edge, pulling all the existing nails out, and just making sure that I'm taking into account, making everything straight and making sure everything's going to line up nice. And now I just cut these out on the bandsaw. I had to flip this one over because I didn't have the throat width on my saw to get to it, but these just popped right back in. They were already cut around the support, so that was why it was nice to use the original shelves, and they match the inside of the cabinet really well. And then I just secured these in with some pins. Now you can see how flush that top piece was, and while I was doing that work, I was painting that piece of doorstop that would act as the stop for the lid to make it nice and flush. So just screwing that back in, making sure it's at the appropriate spot. And now I'm just adding some felt pads to the bottom of the feet. I always like to add felt pads to the bottom of any furniture I make because it's inevitably going to get slid on a wood floor, and the last thing I want is for something to scratch a client's floor with a piece of furniture that I built. So I got a second set of hands. Kerry came by to help me out, and we decided to put it up on a dolly to make it easier to move. That's pretty much it. You can see here from the front of the cabinet, it looks like an ordinary cabinet, and then as you look at it from the back and you let the TV lift go, it exposes this nice TV, and it all sleeks back into that one cabinet. It looks nice and clean. All right, that about does it for this one. This was a good little project. I really enjoyed it, sort of blending the two together, making this motorized lift fit in this antique cabinet was a fun little challenge, and I'm happy with how it came out. If you have any questions about anything I did in the video, any other processes or tools or anything like that, leave them down in the comments below. If you want to see behind the scenes footage and photos of stuff we do in the shop, including this project, follow us on Instagram at MakeEverythingShop. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel, and stay tuned for more content like this. All right, thanks. See you on the next one.